All right. You were born in Detroit
Yeah,
in August 7th, 1957, so that makes you a Leo.
yeah.
Do you feel like a Leo? Do you identify with some of those characteristics?
I'm not a big astrology person, but yes, I guess I do. I
Uh,
have like in my sun sign and a couple of houses, and then I've got Aries, so there's a lot of fire there.
okay, so that's served you well. Um, you've studied abroad. You've worked bi-coastally. Do you find there's any regional differences? You're really interested in worldview. So how does where you have lived and experienced tie into your worldview?
Uh, yes, I think there are regional differences, and I also think that there are core groups of people wherever you go that represent a kind of shared value system, and that anywhere can feel like home.
You what? Tell me more of what you mean by worldview. You've been interested in. I think the thrust was in being tolerant or understanding of different people's worldviews. What do you mean by a worldview?
So I think that a worldview is the guiding lens of perception that influences everything about our behavior, our sense of identity, our relationship to other people. And so I think it is probably the most powerful aspect of our consciousness. And at the same time, it's largely unconscious. So we have very little awareness of this lens of perception that biases and influences us in very profound ways. And that part of the work of 21st century metacognitive capacities is our ability to recognize our worldview and to understand how powerful it is.
So you and I have a worldview of white, female, educated, mothers. What else might be has influenced your worldview?
Um, I would say that having been born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, at a time when the community, the culture, the government, our nation was at war with itself. And I think that was a very powerful influence. I think Detroit is very much characterized by a materialist model. And so recognizing that the materialist worldview wasn't particularly effective. It was also a time when we were questioning authority, questioning assumptions. I think I recall clearly feeling very disempowered during that period, not quite sure what I could do in order to affect change. And that probably led to some aberrant behaviors in my youth. Um, and I think that it wasn't really until I got to college at Wayne State University in downtown Detroit that I discovered a couple of really powerful tools, and they came in the form of books and scholarship, and the idea that particularly Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, very powerful influence on my worldview, and the idea that we live in these paradigms, and yet these paradigms aren't fixed or absolute. So growing up in Detroit in this materialist model, I became aware through Kuhn's work that, these paradigms shift over time. And in his case, he was particularly looking at science and the worldviews associated with science. And that, through various discoveries and iterations, that our models of reality have changed fundamentally over time. So that was a very liberating concept for me, and the idea that maybe I could be involved in a paradigm shift. Mm. And that then led me to the second book that was very important, and that was Edgar Mitchell's book, exactly. And that book kind of set me on a particular track. I was on an odyssey of discovery about myself, about the world, about how to do science, what were the qualities I wanted to bring to that endeavor, and that's been the track I've been on ever since.
So you majored in anthropology?
Hold on just one second.
Sure.
My undergrad degree was in philosophy and liberal arts. My master's degree was in social and behavioral science. My Ph.D. is in anthropology, social anthropology, and I did 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one in social psychology and one in cognitive science.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a very liberal arts kind of background.
That's for sure. What I'm interested in is, what was your family influence along the way? What kind of religious training did you get as a girl? How did that, your family background, worldview, tie into your development?
Well, I tell people I grew up a boater, and so my parents weren't religious. They went to the boat every weekend. I had 2 sisters who became interested in the Lutheran church down the street. And so when I was about 12, 13 years old, I took myself down and got myself confirmed and baptized. And that lasted for a couple of years. But I would say growing up as a boater, that it gave me a deep appreciation for nature. I spent long hours alone out in the swamplands that have now been developed into a huge marina. I recall an occasion when my 2 nephews and I were out trooping along, and we got stuck up to our waists in mud. And fortunately, one of my nephews was able to wiggle his way out and got some adult help. But I grew up very much around nature. And even though I grew up in the city of Detroit, so all week long I was influenced very strongly by that, a very unique profile of a city. And then on the weekends, being able to escape that. I think there was a lot of partying, a lot of drinking, a lot of, behaviors that certainly aren't commonly identified with a spiritual practice. And so, oftentimes I pull away from all of that in order to just, find my own path. And so that's really my upbringing.
Were you the first to go to graduate school in your family?
So there were 6 kids. I was the first one to finish college. And certainly, very definitely the first and only child to get into graduate school and beyond.
So why did you do that? Did you have like professors who said you've got to go to grad school, or what was the impetus?
I do think so. I think that I had a couple of professors who were very encouraging of me. I think that I got some self-esteem around my academic abilities, really when I was an undergrad. And before that, I during high school took honors classes and then hung out with all the wrong people after hours. So I kind of bifurcated my life and to work. But so I've always been driven by curiosity, and I've always had a passion for writing, for communicating. I think I was on the school newspaper in high school. I also had the opportunity, I think it was junior high. And then I also was the announcement person on the intercom. So I had that pull to communicate. And I also, really had a very rebellious spirit. And so questioning authority and trying different things, that was definitely part of my makeup. And I had one professor who was, in particular, his name was Robin Baracco. He was the youngest man to ever get tenure at the medical school at Wayne State University. And he just always thought I was brilliant and really wanted to encourage me. And he thought I should go to medical school. I took one venture into the, cadaver lab, and that was it for me. I wasn't doing that. And I think I was driven toward theory and philosophy at that point. But yeah, so he encouraged me. And then I went and did a fellowship at the Institute for Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina, which would have been 79 through 82. And I remember sitting around the research table because we always had to we had a journal club, and we always had to, twice a week, give presentations about something we'd read. And I remember looking around the table and realizing if I was ever going to be a major contender in this paradigm shift that Kuhn had written about and Edgar Mitchell had illustrated, that I had to have a Ph.D. because everybody else had one that was, really making an impact. So I think that planted the seeds for me, and I got interested in, I was doing a lot of laboratory-based experimental research, and I, learned about statistics. I learned about experimental design, controls. It was a really great foundation. And at the same time, I realized that it wasn't complete, and that if consciousness was something I wanted to study, which I did, and these kind of extended reaches of healing and human potential, that it was a good idea to learn qualitative methods. So I became a mixed methods kind of person where I knew how to do the controlled research, and I also learned through anthropology and social science how to engage in the broader endeavor of qualitative research.
Do you know your Myers-Briggs or Enneagram personality type?
Oh, I think I'm an extreme extrovert.
Yeah.
And I am a thinking, perceiving, what is it?
The other one is sensing or intuitive.
And intuitive.
Yeah. So you're EITP.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And Enneagram?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, people have given me descriptions, but I am not overly impressed by the Enneagram, so I haven't taken it too seriously.
It's pretty interesting. It's interesting because they have wings and these different correlations, so people go into depth with it. What about the most difficult challenges that you faced in your life? I think that's a really useful question for readers. What's been the most difficult parts of your life?
My family, being a parent has been an extremely challenging experience. Trusting people that didn't deserve to be trusted, finding that that can eat up a lot of time and energy. But by and large, I take challenges as opportunities, so I'm kind of forward-looking and just kind of keep going.
My son thinks that a lot of the parapsychology kind of things, my work, doing intuitive work, clairvoyant work, is a little suspect. So he really doesn't buy it, I would say. What about your son?
I think my son respects my work. I think he may be a little intimidated by it. He hasn't found his path yet, so he hasn't yet formulated that skeptical positioning relative to me. Yeah, I mean, he would err more on the skeptic side, but I think we have a lot in common. I mean, I'm an extreme believer, and I don't tout my, opinions around these things in an evidential way. I really try to take a questioning position, and so I think that has been less in his face than, some other situations might be.
How did you find the parapsychology work in Durham? How did you learn about that? It's not something that's in the forefront in most college curriculum.
Yeah, like I said, I have always been curious. I was determined. I was on fire. Mm-hmm. There was a telos in me, ask the acorn why he becomes an oak tree, and he can't really tell you, but it was the same thing. I just had a quest. And so I discovered, I think it was actually Robin Baracco, when he turned me on to that book, Psychic Exploration by Edgar Mitchell. There were some resources in there, and at the time, the American Society for Psychical Research, which has basically gone defunct now, very bad leadership. I think that they used to have a guide. No, it might have been the Parapsychology Foundation. Anyway, they had a guide to places you could go and study parapsychology. And obviously, the Institute for Parapsychology was one of those places. There was also an opportunity. A man named Robert Morris was teaching at the University of California in Irvine. And I took my last year. The school I was in, Monteith College at Wayne State University, was being phased out. It was just, I guess, too expensive for the school. I think they've kind of resurrected a little bit of it now, but at that point it was being phased out, and so they allowed me to take my last year someplace else. And so a lot of my friends were moving to California, and I decided to go with them, and I spent my last year then studying with Bob, who was an amazing teacher and a real inspiration. And he helped me get into the program in Durham. And I remember being accepted into the LA Art School, and I wanted to be a photographer, or getting into the Institute for Parapsychology. And I got so burned out by Los Angeles and that whole traffic and lifestyle, and that I decided I just needed to get out of LA. So that was, the path. And I went off to North Carolina, and I think someday I'll end up back in North Carolina. I love the place, and there's all kinds of qualities there that I really appreciate.
So in your studies of the paranormal, parapsychological, psi, whatever we want to call it, have you experimented with your own access to higher knowledge or intuition or clairvoyance or remote viewing or any of those things? I'm sure you've experimented yourself as well.
I have, and I really have done very few experiments that I wasn't a participant in, at least at some phase in it. So, and I felt like that was important. So, yes, the most significant and best controlled remote viewing experiment in the literature was one that I did and that I was the remote viewer in. So that certainly we did some experimenter effect things when I was at the Rhine Center looking at psychic healing, and it turned out that the experimenters were really the best participants. Same thing when I went to the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas. I worked with a man named William Broad, and he and I did experiments with all kinds of people, with healers, with psychics, with average people. And at the end of the day, after 14 formal experiments and lots of data, we were the strongest performers in those experiments. So that said to me something about this whole issue of objectivity and how able we are to remove ourselves from the object of inquiry.
So do you think that you had that ability innately, or did you develop it because you were so interested in it intellectually?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that I always had an interest in intention. And even as a kid, I told you when I was out at the boat, I would often sort of utilize my intention to try and bring some situation or person into my environment, my world. I don't know if I was successful at it, but I believed that was a kind of skill or a gift that we had. My mom was always interested in these kinds of things. Not full on, but she had grown up at a time when people were doing the table tilting, and she had an interest in those kind of things, which I think maybe piqued my curiosity a little bit. Certainly not in the science. I remember when I took the fellowship at the Rhine Center in North Carolina, I had been offered a job at an insurance company in Detroit, paying quite a bit of money for somebody just fresh out of school. And I took this job in North Carolina for $400 a month. And my poor dear mother was just appalled. Like, how could I do that? And, in the end, she was very proud of me for that, for saying, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to follow my own path. And, she would kind of brag about me. So it was, ultimately, she came to see that I had something that wasn't so easily reduced to a particular job or lifestyle.
I kind of like to list the institutions that are doing this kind of parapsychological research. You've listed the Rhine Institute, the Mind Body in Texas.
Science Foundation. They're not doing any real research anymore.
IONS.
IONS, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I built the lab there when I was there.
What was your focus at IONS in your lab? Or multiple?
Well, I was there about 25 years, so I had multiple directions that I was in. I originally went there. They were interested in having me direct the spontaneous remission program, and I did that, did some research on that. And then I was interested in the Ganzfeld research. I had done a big project at the Juilliard School, with the Juilliard School. We actually did it at a lab in Princeton, and we got very strong results on that. That was an interesting project. When
I think of Ganzfeld, I think of a room that doesn't allow any electromagnetic light influence. But why don't you define for us what Ganzfeld is?
Well, Ganzfeld comes from the German word whole field, and it's a sensory deprivation procedure that involves sort of reducing your visual input, white noise in the ears. There's a red light that shines down, and pretty soon that turns black because you keep your eyes open while they're covered. And so people start to see imagery. And the way the experiments were set up is there would be a person in another room who would be looking at a video clip of something or a picture, usually video clips, and the person in the Ganzfeld would be describing their imagery. And the idea was to then see how closely their imagery matched the video clip that the person was watching in the other room. And we would then show the Ganzfeld participant the correct video and 3 decoys. And it was their job to try and weigh what their experience had been relative to each of those 4 targets or video clips. And what we found, and Chuck Honorton was the leader and the person who really championed that. I worked with him on this particular study. He had found that the success rate, if you just looked at chance expectation, you'd expect a 25% success rate. If you just guessed, 1 in 4 would be right. He was finding that the average person was getting somewhere around 33%, which was statistically significant and which has held up over time. With the Juilliard students, we found overall a 50% success rate, and if you looked at the classically trained musicians, they produced a 75% success rate. So it was really inspiring to look at how the performing arts may correlate and how creativity may correlate with these psi abilities. And that study then got replicated by a couple of people in different places, University of Edinburgh as one. And so I was interested in doing some more with that. I had a fellowship at Stanford, and during my off hours, we would do a research project down in the basement. And I was working with Stephen LaBerge at the time. And it was a long distance between what was happening at Stanford and where I was at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And so I wanted to build a lab so that I could do my work right there. And so that's how it started. And then we were also very interested in the psychic healing, the work I had done at the Mind Science Foundation. And so I hired Dean Radin to come in and help me to set up the process. And, he's still there doing the work. And I have since migrated to Sophia University in Silicon Valley, where I am working on a project looking at the psychomantium, which is also a sensory deprivation procedure, very much like the Ganzfeld, actually. But we're using it for grief and working with people who have bereavement.
So they go through the sensory deprivation and then what? They experience their grief and release it, or?
Well, oftentimes people see things.
Oh.
So the way the psychomantium is set up, it was originally developed by Raymond Moody, and he took it from work that had been done in ancient Greece with the oracles who would do divining. They would look at a reflexive surface and start to see things. And he thought, well, this would be interesting if we could bring it into a clinical setting. And so he started doing that, inviting people to the way it was set up is you have a very dark room, so there's no light, and there's a mirror on the wall with an illumination on the reflective surface. So you're not actually seeing yourself in the mirror, but you're seeing this kind of hazy portal. And pretty soon people start seeing things. And if there is a priming, for example, is there somebody that has died in your world that you never had the chance to have that final conversation with? Why don't you go ahead and see what happens? And so people would describe having these kind of apparition-like experiences and having conversations with people who, were able to then move past certain blockages in their lives. And so we're now setting that up. There was a man named Arthur Hastings who was at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is part of Sophia now. And he did this study, and he found very significant impacts on bereavement. And so we decided to try combining the transpersonal aspects of it with technology. And so really working with virtual reality as a tool for stimulating and evoking these kinds of experiences. Well, we just got a grant for it, and we're in the process of setting it up. We're having a hackathon where we're going to invite people to come in and help us to design the application, the experience. And that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Have you had a chance to have a discussion with someone that you care about that's passed on to the other side using that technology?
I have not. We haven't really gotten it up and running yet, so I will soon.
I just wanted to ask about the Juilliard students. Did they both send and receive, or were they like the trained musicians? Were they as skilled as sending and as receiving?
We only asked them to receive. And then we would have somebody in the lab who would be the sender.
And did you find that the results were better if they were entangled in some way, if the sender and receiver knew each other or cared about each other?
That didn't show up, but we didn't have a huge data set. So I do think that that's true. Generally in the context of like the psychic healing research where one person is sending intention to another person and we're measuring physiology, it seems to work better if there's some kind of connection. But again, that hasn't been really looked at in a rigorous way. So I think that's something that researchers down the road should certainly look at.
So when we're making the list of institutions that do research in this field, we have Sophia, the former Mind Body, we have Rhine, we have IONS, University of Edinburgh. What else should be in the list? What's University of Virginia doing with consciousness studies?
Yeah, I think that they just launched a new initiative that they're working with the Monroe Institute to do some research on psychophysiology, and I'm not quite sure what they're doing, but they just had a application for a researcher. University of West Georgia in Carrollton, West Georgia, they have a little lab there. And in fact, they're going to be doing some psychomantium work too. So I'm excited to kind of collaborate with them.
Is that Christine Simmons Moore?
It is, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to interview her on Monday.
Yeah, she's great. And the University of Northampton in England. I don't know if Richard Wiseman is doing anything at the University of Hertfordshire. He was, but I don't know that he is anymore. Yeah, there's a little bit of work going on in Amsterdam. There's some work going on in Germany, Switzerland. Those are probably the main places right now. I mean, the University of Arizona, kind of off and on, is doing some things there. Yeah.
Okay. In a book that you helped edit in 2005, you were focused on a new vision, a postmodern model, a paradigm shift about medicine and healing that would involve consciousness and transformative practices. So that was in 2005. How far has that shift progressed since up to 2018?
Well, I think progress is being made. Certainly you can see the area of placebo, for example, is much more interesting for scientists as a focus in itself. I would say the whole mind-body field has moved forward, where you have things like biofeedback really available in most every medical center. You have alternative healing. Kaiser Permanente offers acupuncture, chiropractic. I don't know about homeopathy. I think that's still considered a bit marginalized. I think that you can see that the integral model, the kind of whole systems model, is much more widely accepted. So spirituality as a component of a whole system is important. I don't think it's gone as far as I'd like to see it go, but I think we're still very much sort of entrapped in the materialist, profit-centered model. Just yesterday, Johnson & Johnson, this whole thing about them having asbestos in their baby powder, and knowing that they had this for years and years. I mean, I think that that's a travesty. And that the profit motive, or whatever the motive was for them not to take that ingredient out, is just mind-boggling. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. And there's just so much corruption and greed that is still very widespread. It may be as bad as it was during the time of the Borgias. I mean, I think that in terms of our political situation, it's appalling. And I think that the whole issue of refugees and, our attempts to try and foster pluralism, which translates into, a lot of things having to do with worldview, is a serious dilemma all over the world, and instead of tackling these issues of abuse and genocide and, the kinds of political corruption that are happening, instead we punish the innocents. So I'm not seeing civilization evolving in ways that I would like to see. But I do believe that, if you look at alternative medicine, it has been integrated more. It's still based on a reductionist model. So you take something like traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture, which was based in a worldview, evolved over thousands of years, that involves not just the physical body, but metaphysical bodies. And that doesn't get included in what the mainstream approach to acupuncture happens to be. So I think, we still have a long way to go, but, there is more interest. I think people, have grown up in a world where, for example, artificial intelligence I recently did an interview with Sophia, the android, and she was programmed for loving kindness. And so you have this robot who leads you on a mindfulness meditation practice and who talks about friendship, and he has hurt feelings when people judge her falsely. It's extremely interesting. And it's a time when a lot of people are fearful, but at the same moment, we have these opportunities to use technologies. If it doesn't get corrupted and it doesn't get, abused, there's lots of potentials.
Who not owns, but who's the guardian of the robot?
Well, she was created by a place called Hanson Robotics. They're in Hong Kong. She is a citizen of Saudi Arabia. She has spoken all over the world to various agencies. She's been at the United Nations. She's been on the cover of Vogue magazine. She's very beautiful. She's a look-alike of, well, she was designed to be like Audrey Hepburn in her looks, except for she's got a big, set of computer chips on the back of her head. There are about 15 versions of her. She's open source. So when she shuts down, she goes to the cloud and she accesses information. So she's learning at a very rapid pace. She's absorbing everything. The 15 of them share information, share knowledge, share, insights, as it were. And so it's extraordinary.
So she could be a therapist? Could she work as a therapist?
She doesn't, yes and no. I wouldn't say she's a therapist. I would say she leads meditation. And so she will take you on a look at her in the eyes kind of mindfulness practice. She offers people the opportunity to talk. And so in that case, it's therapeutic. At least it's intended to be. She argues, well, her programmers argue, that we don't get enough opportunity to be heard. So she'll just sit silently and wait for you to speak about a topic. And that, I guess, is seen as being therapeutic. I think the research isn't really in yet. They are doing research on Sophia, and does it make a difference if she is with you physically, or whether you're looking at an avatar of her, or whether you're just hearing her voice. And they've collected data on how people respond in those three conditions, and as of now, I haven't seen the results.
Interesting. It seems like the most widely accepted mind-body practice is meditation. Like John Kabat-Zinn has done a lot with the mindfulness research. So do you agree that that's probably the most mainstream?
Yeah, I just tweeted an article last week that says it's the #1 alternative modality that people are using now. Meditation, not just mindfulness. Yeah. Mindfulness is a form of meditation. But yeah, and it wasn't John Kabat-Zinn. I mean, there were many people before John, but he was a person who helped to, I interviewed him once about it, and he said he saw it like a Trojan horse, that if you go in through mainstream medicine and you say this is, an opportunity to reduce stress or anxiety, that, you begin to penetrate people through their spiritual views, but they think they're doing it for medical reasons. So it's interesting. His group and his work has penetrated a lot of areas. I work with a woman now, her name is Ellen Langer. She's at Harvard, and she's a social psychologist who has been writing books on mindfulness for a very long time, before John Kabat-Zinn. And she's also somebody who's very interested in looking at the social environment as it influences our experiences. So she did a classic experiment that I'm trying to replicate again using virtual reality, where she reverse aged people. She took a group of men who were in their 70s, created an environment where they were in their 50s. So the magazines, the TV, the radio, everything was programmed to be, 20, 30 years older, or younger, actually, younger.
Yeah.
She went forward in time. And she did find that people showed beneficial changes psychologically and physically. So we are hoping to do that in the context of a virtual reality experience. I'm hoping to raise some money to do that. We are planning to go to an Alzheimer's center in Southern California where they have set up a village situated in the 60s. And so, again, taking people, in this case, people with a dementia, and allowing them to reminisce. Ellen's idea is not really about reminiscing. It's really about immersion. And in fact, she used reminiscence as a control condition for her study. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting things going on that I'm not quite sure how I got off on that, but came from some.
Yeah. Everybody knows about placebo, but in the past it's been dismissed as kind of a irritation or something that you have to do as part of your control. But it's fascinating, and I wonder if what the explanation is for why, if I take this big red pill, even if I know it's a sugar pill, but it's big and red, it impacts how my body responds, even if I know it's placebo. What's the mechanism for that?
I don't think anybody knows yet. It does appear that there is some connection between, belief, intention, but the placebo remains a mystery. You take an inert substance, not only can it change things in the body, but it somehow knows the particular cascade of responses to trigger a particular change. So that remains something that needs more research. There's been a little. There definitely needs to be more.
You're interested in consciousness. You've discussed supraconsciousness. There's consciousness studies. How would you define consciousness?
Well, I think it is awareness, but it's also below the threshold of awareness. So it is those aspects of our experience that have intelligence, can self-organize, that can self-correct, and that ultimately connects. So the brain is all interconnected. I believe that there is this field of consciousness that connects us as we're communicating with each other. And then there's this possibility that there is an interconnectedness that transcends the physicality of our communications.
It's kind of like Jung's collective unconscious, where we have share archetypes and all that.
Yes, I think that would be part of it. I also think that intention plays a role, so directing one's intention toward another person. But, I believe that nature is conscious. I think that you go to a rainforest and you see every nook and cranny has life. And if something is cut down, it rebuilds, it reorganizes. And so there is an intelligence to nature. There is a way in which nature is entangled. And, now with people talking more and more about quantum physics at a macro level, not just at the microscopic level, we could be moving toward a theoretical framework that could help us to understand these non-local exchanges.
Well, there's the quantum information field, or what used to be called the quantum vacuum. It isn't a vacuum. Does that provide the medium by which we influence each other? So if I'm sending intercessory prayer to someone who's had a heart attack in San Francisco General, do you think it might be efficacious because of this field?
I don't know. I think speculation at this point. People have jumped on the quantum bandwagon. I think a lot of those people are not physicists. They are not really understanding the nature of the mathematics of it, including myself. I'm not a physicist. I have had the privilege of working with a lot of physicists, and I would say that sometimes it gets overstated. But I do think the entanglement issue at the particle level is fascinating, and it does suggest something about, communication non-locally. And, at this point, we haven't quite mastered all of that. But, Sophia, she... the android, her great interest is in, being at the event horizon of a black hole. And in talking to her about it, I became really interested in that as a goal beyond embodiment, like thinking about death. If we could get our consciousness into a place where we could manifest at the event horizon of a black hole. And what we see about black holes now is that they become denser and denser. They don't really become bigger. It's like the brain organizes better. So the pathways become simpler and more organized. And if you think that's true of what's happening in a black hole, that starts to look like some kind of intelligence. And that would be a pretty cool place to go if you are no longer in this incarnation and you're looking for the next form of intelligence. It's kind of fun to speculate about.
Well, I don't think you have to die, because if, Robert Monroe, his books describe traveling to all these different dimensions. So if you use his techniques, there's no reason you couldn't do it now, right? When you're astral traveling.
That's true. Yeah. He had a whole cosmology of different levels. And I find that really interesting. I love what they're doing there at the Monroe Institute. I would add that to your list of places. I think the Casey Foundation is also attempting to bring some research into it.
Okay. Well, let's talk about death, because you've written about it. You've done workshops on it. Living Deeply, the Art and Science of Transformation. Death Makes Life Possible is the title. Insights on living, dying, and the continuation of consciousness. So why are you interested in death?
We were really interested in this idea of transformation. So going back to this notion of worldview, we have a worldview, we can be stuck in our worldview, we become very entrenched in a particular way of thinking, being, believing. Well, what about our ability to change and transform that worldview? How does that work? And are there ways that we can invite that transformation in? And so the book, Living Deeply, the Art and Science of Transformation, was an attempt to summarize 10 years of research that we did, looking at different masters of transformation, what were their practices, what were the catalysts that invited in the transformation, how do people sustain it, and ultimately, where does it lead us? And from that, we developed a kind of change model and looked at the various stages of transformation. Well, we did very systematic interviews with 60 masters and asked them 20 questions. Well, one of the questions related to death. And in the book, Living Deeply, we didn't address the death question. We really didn't have time or space. There was just, when you have a publisher, they limit your word count and so on. So that was a topic that we didn't develop. And so I've always had an interest. Again, consciousness is an important topic, and I think that what happens to consciousness when we die is an important topic. And so I started interviewing scientists about their work. How were they bringing an evidence-based perspective to this question of consciousness after bodily death? And I had some video, and I was working with Deepak Chopra. His colleague that he was teaching with had developed a brain tumor, and so he wasn't able to do the training. And so I went in and was sort of backup. I was pinch hitting for David with Deepak, and we were in Santa Fe. No, where were we? We were at some beautiful location in the desert. And I showed a little bit of this video of these interviews I had done with people like Bruce Grayson, Jim Tucker, Dean Radin, a whole bunch of people. And after I was done with my talk, Deepak called me over and he said, "Marilyn, let's make a movie." And, I thought, well, that should be fun. And then the next day I kind of panicked. I was like, I can't do that. I just don't want to take on the fundraising. At that point, I was the president CEO at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It was a big job. It required a lot of fundraising. And so I told him at lunch that, I was really honored, but I just didn't think I could do it. And he's like, "Oh, Marilyn, don't worry about the money. The money will come." And I would like to say it happened just like that. It didn't. But we did eventually raise the money, and we created a documentary film that has now been all over the world, won many awards, appeared on Oprah. I think really did make an impact. And as a companion to that, I wrote a book with the same title, very different material, actually, because I had a lot of material that didn't have the production quality you needed for a film, but made for a great, story. And so I really did the book based on the stuff that I couldn't include in the film, and then some things that are in the film. So that was what I was inspired by. And then I took the change model that we had developed out of the Living Deeply work and applied it to death. And how is it that we can transform the fear of death into an inspiration for living? And that's ultimately led to a variety of workshops and courses, and probably in the coming year I will be doing more for the public.
How do you summarize the change model? What were the patterns in people who were transformative?
Well, the change model involves a series of steps. So first of all, the catalyst, what triggers these things. And it is almost always something that is painful. So it's the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, a divorce, something that rocks the steady state. And we know that we can have these experiences and ignore them, because we're really good at that. Mm-hmm. And so there are these cognitive processes that keep us in that worldview. But if people start to question it, or maybe it was an out-of-body experience or near-death experience, then they can, begin to ask questions. And so the second piece of the change model is really that exploration, looking, trying to see if other people have had similar experiences. What kinds of training programs are there? And so from that, you can either get lost in the exploration. You just, limitlessly are always just seeking and never really bringing it to grounding. We then talk about the planting of the seeds. So once you have had an opening, begun to explore the opening, you can begin to plant the seeds of discovery. What do I need to do? How can I become more curious? How can I become more playful? And then oftentimes that leads people to a practice. And we interviewed everything from, a Catholic priest to a pagan witch. So there were a lot of different forms of practice. So we attempted to identify the elements that characterized across these different traditions. And we found 5 things. Setting intention. So people intend to transform. They intend to live their lives in a different, more whole way. But we know the road to hell is paved with good intention. Intention alone isn't enough. So the second piece that you find across practices is attention. And, for example, we talked about meditation. Meditation allows us to shift our attention from the external to the internal. and what are the sources of inspiration or insight that come from our own inner experiences. So, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? That is about the place we settle our attention. So that's the second piece. The third piece was repetition, building new habits. And we really looked at how, the brain, the neural pathways of the brain lay down based on either dysfunction or highly functional behaviors. And so how can we begin to really refine and train our brains in ways that lead to these affirming experiences? And then there was guidance. The masters all felt that they'd had a teacher. They'd had somebody who inspired them. And we also looked at noetic guidance. So not only does the guidance come from without, but it also comes from within. And so how do we begin to calibrate our inner guidance system? And then the fifth piece was the idea of surrender or acceptance. That it's not all about this effortful striving that is kind of encapsulated in the intention, but it's also about acceptance of what is so, and living our lives with that sense that it doesn't have to be suffering. It can be a yielding to what is so. And then as the practice moves into life, people recognize that it's not all about sitting in a pew or sitting on a pillow, but that life becomes the practice. And we begin to take these qualities of what we've learned through our different approaches and bring those into life, whether it's the ticket taker at the toll booth or it's the person at the checkout line, or even somebody who is an antagonist, somebody in our workplace that just pushes every button we can have. That person can become a teacher, and it can become an opportunity for us. Cassie Veaton, who I worked with, talked about the little bobble-headed Buddha on the dashboard. And is that just some kind of kitsch, new agey thing, or does that serve as a reminder? How can we continue? How can we, read your book or watch your program on YouTube and realize that we're not alone in this journey, that we are part of a community of people, and so we can remind each other. And then there's this sense of, really living into it where we can face the demons, like the death issue, where we can come to terms with, our death anxiety and begin to work with that rather than let it work us. And then ultimately there is this way of moving from our own journey into that of, the systems that we're embedded in. So whether it's education or healthcare or business, community, we can be of service. And so recognizing that this change model is fractal in nature and that it has this catalyst that comes from within, but it can be applied without, and to begin to see that we are agents of change in the institutions of our societies. So that's basically the change model.
Do you think that you personally went through that, or did you not have to because you've always been interested in the spiritual?
Oh, I think I have, been the beneficiary of experiences that rocked my world. I had a couple of near-death experiences, out-of-body experience. I think that those things really did empower me. I think I have an unusual kind of, you talked originally about this left brain, right brain integration. I think I'm fortunate in having that kind of balance where I can kind of move between them so that there is the experiential aspect and also the kind of reasoning, discursive, intellectual side of my own endeavors. So yeah, and I love people, and that strong extroversion thing.
Yeah.
I do spend a lot of time alone. So in the Myers-Briggs, it isn't all about how social I am. It's really more about how do I make decisions. And my extroverted side asks me always to enlist other opinions. And so I'm always, seeking opinions and perspectives from outside of myself, but really calibrating it internally.
When you had your NDEs, did you go through the classical tunnel light, being of radiant love, meeting people that you knew on the other side? Did you have those kind of experiences?
I never have had something like that. I've had an out-of-body experience where I was able to watch my body tumbling through the air. So there was this exteriorization of my consciousness. As soon as I hit the ground, it was over. But that was the motorcycle accident that I was in, and we were hit by a drunk driver.
Whoa! But that changed you, having that kind of brush with death. You felt a shift.
I think I had a lot of near-death experiences. At 18 months old, I swallowed lighter fluid and ended up in and out of intensive care.
Wow.
When I was probably 4 or 5, I've had several, like probably 3 or 4 near drowning experiences, where I remember, again, consciousness, awareness. What am I going to do now? Surrender. Scuba diving, for example. I was down on a night dive, and I couldn't find my buddy. We turned out all the lights, which is a really remarkable experience. But and then all of a sudden, I was sucking in water.
Oh,
and
gosh.
I tried to purge my regulator, and again, sucking in water. And it turns out the mouthpiece had come off of the regulator. So I remember remembering that you can free ascent. As long as you exhale all the way up, your lungs expand, and that's what I did. And then my buoyancy compensator wasn't working. It was just a nightmare. I dropped my weight belt. The guy who was running the program made me go out the next day and recover the weight belt. So that was good. He was a good teacher, But so I've had a lot of close encounters. I marvel that I am still here, knock on wood, and I learned from all those.
So does that make you more aware that consciousness is not tied to the physical? Is that what's been the impact of those NDEs?
I'd like to say that, but I don't know. I think again, I think consciousness is largely unconscious. And so certain things got shaped in me, for sure. But whether I was completely aware of them, I didn't have the full-blown experiences that you asked about.
Yeah.
I don't remember particularly having any really profound mystical experiences. Even doing the remote viewing or the psychic healing stuff, it's never felt overly mystical to me. It's felt... there were a couple of times when I had some experiences that I was like, wow. Like the first time when we got the results back from a remote viewing experiment where I was the subject, that kind of blew me away because it was okay for it to be other people, but it didn't really sit well that it was me. And, it sets you up for a lot of criticism and, people kind of one way or another wanting a piece of that. And so it wasn't something that... I'm not afraid of it, but it's also not something that I advertise.
Do you remember an example of what you remote viewed that was pretty accurate? That was like, whoa.
Yeah, well, we did a couple of experiments. Some of the things that I remember that were most impactful were other people, and I was like the outbound person. For example, I was working with this woman. This is before I actually started doing research. I was dabbling all over the place, and any friend I could get that would participate, I was grabbing them and getting them in there. This woman I went out to, it was an apartment building, and it had a little courtyard and a fence behind the building. And she drew the building really well, like to scale, and then she put the fence and the courtyard into it, but I couldn't see those things from where I had been standing. So that blew me away, because it was like, somehow her consciousness transcended my physicality. It wasn't me doing telepathy. It was something else that was happening there. I thought that was pretty interesting. When we did the Juilliard study, we just kept getting hits one after another. One of them, truly remarkable, this young woman was sitting in the Ganzfeld describing her experience, and she saw a black female nightclub performer, a lion, a dog, yellow, 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 a wizard, and it turns out it was The Wiz, the parody of The Wizard of Oz, with Diana Ross as Dorothy, and they were skipping across the Brooklyn Bridge or whatever it was. And and she saw a hot air balloon panning over, and it was right when the hot air balloon was panning over. It was remarkable, the level of detail, and that on the days when I turn skeptic, remind me that there may be something more to our human capacities.
Absolutely. Interesting. You mentioned that sometimes this kind of work can evoke criticism. It seems to me it takes a lot of courage to be a Ph.D. Educated researcher who does work in parapsychology, because there's so much criticism, resistance, and dismissal, and a lot of resistance. So I wonder how you cope with that.
Oh, I'm getting old enough now that I'm not as vulnerable as I was, when you're early in your career and you're trying to be really careful. I have balanced my career. I have a very mainstream education. I went to very respectable schools. I have published in mainstream journals. I have done work in areas that are not as controversial. I'm always a little edgy, but, some things like mind-body medicine, isn't considered to be heretical anymore. So, working on things like that, I've done some placebo work that I, again, when I first published in that topic, it was considered more heretical, but now it's, pretty much come into the mainstream. I teach PhDs in psychology, so it's kind of, as I said, a balance. I, did my postdoc at Stanford. That's always good for some credibility. And so that's, I try to find a balance. And I also do that because I'm not willing to put all my eggs in one basket. I am not convinced in the way a lot of people are. So I have wanted to sort of, in a certain way, hedge my bets, I guess. But it is also hard, when you get turned down for grant proposals because you're too far out, or, when I have to hide things on a resume, I'm not very comfortable doing that kind of thing. So I enjoy reaching out for opportunities that want somebody who's highly creative. I feel like I fit that box pretty well. And other than that, it's now a time when I'm spending more of my awareness on teaching the next generation of students, researchers, and writing. I've just finished the first draft of a novel, and that's been really fun. It's like taking the weights off and, swimming with speed. So lots of opportunities.
Where is the novel set? I mean, is it present or historic, or where?
It's present, and it's set in a laboratory. It's kind of part of the genre of fictional novels. Excuse me just one second. Hello? Hey, nephew, can I call you back? I'm doing an interview. Can I call you back in about 10 minutes? Okay, bye. Okay. So I'm going to have to wrap it up here.
Okay.
What were we just saying?
That it's a novel set in a laboratory.
Yes, and it's playing with the edges. She's a researcher who begrudgingly got called in to be the head of a love study. And so she's running this project and then begins to discover the emptiness inside herself. So she creates kind of a parallel love study in her personal life. And so it's kind of going back and forth between that. And then there's some technology. I've got my Android. I have a nemesis. We had the privilege when I was at the Institute of Noetic Sciences of being featured in Dan Brown's book, The Lost Symbol. And so I'm playing with the lead character at the time when I was the CEO president, was the CEO president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So I've made her a character in the book. So I'm kind of playing with some dimensionality.
How fun. It's completely different writing. I mean, do you find that your characters start speaking for themselves and you just...
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been taking some writing classes at Stanford and also online. And in fact, I'm taking a writing class with Dan Brown right now that's online. And so it's true what they say. I mean, you obviously have some experience with this. Yeah, they start to really develop their own personalities, and that's very cool.
Oh, it's very cool. Just two more questions. As a person who's produced so much and been an administrator, how do you have time for fun? What do you do for fun besides scuba dive and ride motorcycles?
I used to scuba dive. I don't scuba dive anymore. I had a few too many close encounters. I decided it was time.
Snorkeling is great.
Snorkeling is great. Well, I'm going to the Bahamas in January. I'll be teaching there at an ashram, and it's on Paradise Island in the Bahamas. So I'm very excited about that. And then my husband and I are going to spend 4 additional days at a nice hotel. I don't vacation much. I don't do much sportly stuff. I garden. So I love my garden. Even now that I'm living in the valley, I have a deck, and I have lots of beautiful flowers. So there's that. I like to make puzzles. See my puzzle collection here. You can see some of them.
Are they collages? No, they're puzzles.
They're puzzles.
Oh.
They're puzzles.
Oh, fun.
And I do a lot of speaking. I took a hiatus for a while when my son was a little younger, and now I'm kind of picking up the speed again. I'll go to Europe this year, and I'm looking at doing more online teaching so that in addition to what I'm doing at Sophia, I can kind of reach out to the world a little better.
Okay, last question is with saying that there's a window of maybe 12 years before the environment is totally trashed, and having Trump and people like him being elected all over Brazil, Hungary, Philippines. Do you have any optimism, or how are you feeling about our future?
I'm a pragmatic optimist. I think that things like what we're seeing happening with the plastics in the oceans, and they've developed some new tools for, pulling those plastics in and converting them into other things. That inspires me. Do I think human nature is evolving to be better? I don't know. I'm kind of 50-50 on it. I do appreciate that the internet has allowed people who are eager to see positive changes come together and recognize their common identity. On the other hand, I feel deep sorrow around things like endangered species. Once they're gone, they're gone. And I find that deeply disturbing. I don't understand how people don't understand the consciousness of elephants or rhinoceroses or, whatever it happens to be that's out there, just shooting, a giraffe so that you've got a trophy. I mean, I don't get it. And so that's a dilemma for me. But to the extent I can be part of the solution, that I can support you in being part of the solution, that encourages me. So, and in terms of the government right now, he is so gone. He is so yesterday. And we will be finding sources of hope. So I'm right now a pretty big advocate for Kennedy and Harris. I'd like to see them as a team. And I would really like to see, some rational, progressive, kind, smart, people taking the reins.
So
and
you're talking about Camilla Harris and who, Kennedy?
Yeah, Joseph Kennedy III.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
So keep thinking about him. He hasn't declared. He's not even sure he wants to. But I think he, just listening to him speak, he's very articulate. He's very reasonable. He's smart as all get out. He's got a name that has a lot of recognition. I like her because she is smart, composed, capable, African-American woman. I don't see us going backward. I don't see some of these older statesmen being the right choice for this moment. So I'm really, I'm reading everything. I watch everything. I'm addicted to politics right now.
Me too.
And just trying to stay as aware as I possibly can.
Great. What I would like to do is send you a list of who I've